I spent 60 months buying a house I would never own, but the real price was a sister's smile and my parents' betrayal. Standing at the edge of the manicured rose garden during Clara's wedding, my heart-shaped face felt frozen in a mask of polite joy, though my blood was boiling beneath my maroon velvet bodice. For 5 long years, I had transferred every cent of the property debt from my accounts to theirs, saving the family home from foreclosure while my parents, Arthur and Martha, cried about their financial hardship. I had foregone vacations and luxury, wearing the same vintage rose-patterned skirt for years just to ensure they had a roof over their heads. Then, during the toast, my father stood up, his eyes gleaming with a pride I had never received. As a wedding gift, he announced, his voice booming over the string quartet, "We are giving the family estate to Clara and her new husband, debt-free." The room erupted in applause, but the silence in my soul was deafening. Clara looked at me, a smirk playing on her lips, knowing exactly whose sweat and tears had paid for her new kingdom. I felt the weight of the thin silver necklace against my collarbone, the red teardrop pendant a perfect symbol of the wound they had just opened. I didn't scream. I didn't faint. I realized that my family was a business I no longer wished to invest in. They hadn't just given away a house, they had given away the daughter who kept them in it. The betrayal was hyperspecific, a 5-year curiosity loop of lies that finally closed with a bang. As I watched the sunset hit the garden with a shallow depth of field, blurring the guests into a creamy bouquet of insignificance, I knew the debt was finally settled, just not in the way they expected. 8 weeks later, the silence of my holiday cottage was broken by a phone call I should have ignored. I had retreated to the woods, far from the city and the drama of Clara's renovation plans, which apparently involved gutting the history I had paid to preserve. My mother's voice was frantic, a sharp contrast to the soft ambient light filtering through the pines. "Elena, darling, Clara needs the guest rooms for her new in-laws. She says we're cramping her style. We need to move into your vacation house immediately." There was no please, no thank you for the 5 years of mortgage payments. Just the assumption that my resources were their safety net. I looked around my sanctuary, at the structured velvet cushions and the peace I had finally found, and felt a cold resolve. "No, Martha," I said, using her first name for the first time. "That house is mine. I bought it with the money I didn't spend on your mortgage this month." The line went dead for a moment, the tension simmering like a Rembrandt lighting setup in a dark room. "How can you be so cruel?" she hissed. "We are your parents. We gave you life. And I gave you 5 years of shelter," I replied, my voice steady. "The transaction is complete." Over the next few days, the messages grew darker. My father threatened legal action, claiming adverse possession or some other nonsense he'd found on a legal forum. My sister sent photos of her new designer kitchen, paid for by the equity I had built. They weren't asking for help, they were demanding a tribute. I changed the locks on the cottage and installed a motion-activated security system. I knew they were desperate, but I didn't realize that desperation was a mask for a much deeper secret they were hiding within the walls of the home I once called mine. The police called me at 3 a.m., the vibration of my phone on the nightstand sounding like a structural collapse. "Ms. Elena? This is Officer Miller. We have a gentleman here, an Arthur, who was caught attempting to bypass the perimeter of your holiday property." My heart hammered against my ribs, a dull ache in the center of my chest. My own father had actually tried to break in. But the officer's tone wasn't just formal, it was hesitant. "There's more, Ms. Elena. We found him in the shed, but he wasn't alone. And he wasn't just looking for a place to sleep. You might want to come down here. He was carrying a lockbox, one that belongs to the estate your sister just inherited." I drove through the darkness, the 85mm lens of my eyes focused only on the road ahead, the world a blur of gray shadows. When I arrived at the station, my father looked smaller, older, his face etched with a visible dermal texture that no filter could hide. He wouldn't look at me. In the evidence bag on the table sat a rusted iron box. I recognized it immediately. It was the emergency fund my grandfather had always talked about, something my parents claimed had been lost in a bank fire years ago. He was trying to bury it on your land, Elena, the officer whispered. But that's not the weird part. Look at the date on the property deed inside. I leaned in, the fluorescent lights of the station creating harsh, unflattering shadows. The deed for the family home wasn't in my parents' names. It hadn't been for 10 years. The mortgage payments I had been making for 5 years weren't going to a bank. They were going to a private shell company. My skin went cold as I realized the debt I had been paying was a phantom, a clever trap designed to bleed me dry while they waited for a bigger payday. But who owned the shell company? And why was my father so terrified of Clara finding the box? I stared at the deed in the harsh station light, my fingers tracing the name CM Acquisitions LLC printed in cold, block letters. The officer, whose name tag read Miller, watched me with a pity that made my skin crawl. I did a quick search on the registration, Elena, he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. The principal owners are Martha and Clara. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. My own mother and sister hadn't just taken the house. They had built a financial cage for me 5 years ago and watched me lock myself in. I began sifting through the lockbox, ignoring my father's muffled sobs from the corner of the interrogation room. There were ledgers, handwritten in my mother's elegant script, detailing every transfer I'd made. Next to my payments were notes: Clara's Paris trip, Clara's wedding venue deposit, Clara's designer bridal gown. Every sacrifice I had made. The missed dinners, the 5-year-old rose-patterned skirt, the overtime shifts, had been a direct subsidy for Clara's vanity. They hadn't been in debt, they were in luxury, funded by my misplaced guilt. The property debt was a fabrication, a phantom lien they used to extort my loyalty. I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me, a cinematic mood of focused vengeance replacing the sorrow. The wedding gift wasn't a gift at all, it was a laundering operation. By gifting the house to Clara, they were trying to move the asset out of the shell company before I could ever claim equity. But they had made one fatal mistake: they assumed I would keep paying without ever looking at the title. My father wasn't breaking into my cottage to hide from Clara, he was trying to bury the only evidence that proved they had embezzled nearly $500,000 from their own flesh and blood. I didn't wait for the sun to rise before I drove back to the family estate. The garden was dark, the pink roses now just black, jagged shapes in the moonlight, but I didn't need light to find my way. I let myself in with the key they didn't know I still had. Inside, the house smelled of expensive vanilla candles and Clara's signature perfume. I found them in the kitchen, Martha, Clara, and her new husband, huddled over a laptop in the soft glow of the under-cabinet lighting. They looked up, their faces pale under the designer fixtures. "Elena? What are you doing here?" Clara demanded, her voice shrill with a fake authority that no longer worked on me. I threw the ledger onto the marble island, the sound like a gunshot in the silent house. "CM Acquisitions," I said, my voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. 5 years of fraud, Martha. Did you really think I wouldn't find the lockbox? My mother's face transformed, the victim mask slipping to reveal a predatory coldness. "We did what we had to do to secure Clara's future," she hissed, her eyes narrowing. "You were always the stable one, the boring one. You didn't need the money like she did." The sheer logic of their betrayal was breathtaking. They viewed my hard work not as a virtue, but as a resource to be mined. Clara stepped forward, her eyes gleaming with the same smirk I'd seen at the wedding. "It doesn't matter, Elena. The deed is in my name now. It was a legal gift. You can't touch it." I looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time, a hollow shell of a person built on stolen foundations. "Actually, Clara," I whispered, leaning in so she could see the lack of mercy in my hazel eyes, "a gift is only legal if the givers have the right to transfer the title. And since you and Martha used a shell company to defraud a co-contributor, the IRS and the DA are going to have a much bigger interest in this gift than I do." The fallout was swift and devastating, a clinical dismantling of their house of cards. I didn't just call the police, I called a forensic accountant and the district attorney's office. Because the shell company had been used to bypass gift taxes and hide assets from actual creditors, including the very bank they claimed they owed, the entire transfer was flagged as criminal money laundering. The authorities didn't just phone me. They invited me to provide the final statement that led to the seizure. Within weeks, the wedding gift was under a federal lien, and Clara's new husband had already filed for an annulment, unwilling to be tied to a family of fraudsters. My parents, the victims of their own greed, found themselves exactly where they feared, homeless and facing indictment. Clara tried to crawl back to me, weeping about family bonds in my cottage driveway, but I kept the gates locked and the security cameras active. I didn't feel joy at their ruin, only a profound sense of relief, like a heavy weight finally lifted from my heart. I eventually reached a settlement where the house was sold to cover the back taxes and my restitution. I didn't want the estate, the memories were forever tainted by the smell of velvet and lies. I took my share and invested it into my vacation home, turning the cottage into a permanent sanctuary. Standing in my garden now, the sun setting in a perfect golden hour glow, I look at the new roses I planted myself. They aren't for a wedding or for a show, they are for me. The 5-year debt is finally paid, the curiosity loop of my life is closed, and for the first time in 60 months, I don't owe anyone a single thing. I am the sole owner of my future, and the view from here is breathtakingly clear.